The wind howled across the empty plains of Wyoming like a restless ghost. Inside a lonely ranch house, Jacob Hale sat by the fireplace sharpening a hunting knife. The flames flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows across the room. Jacob had lived alone for 5 years. 5 long years since the accident that took his wife. Out here, silence was his only companion, until that night that a sudden pounding exploded on the door. 3 sharp knocks, then silence. Jacob froze. No one came to this ranch after dark. That he slowly stood, hand drifting toward the revolver on the table. Another knock, louder this time. Please, a weak voice whispered outside. Help me. Jacob opened the door, and what he saw nearly stopped his heart. That a young woman stood in the moonlight, soaked, shaking, and barely able to stand. Her clothes were torn, mud covered her boots, her dark hair clung to her pale face. She collapsed before he could even speak. Jacob caught her just before she hit the ground. Easy now, he muttered. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she whispered something in broken English. They're coming. Then she fainted in his arms, but Jacob didn't yet know something far worse. Riders were already heading toward his ranch. The woman woke hours later. The storm had passed. A lantern glowed softly beside the bed. Jacob sat nearby in a chair, quietly watching. When her eyes opened, fear rushed across her face. She tried to sit up. Easy, Jacob said calmly, you're safe. Her breathing slowed. You saved me. Jacob nodded. What's your name? She hesitated. Aiko. Her accent was thick, but her voice was steady. Japanese? Jacob asked. She nodded, then her expression darkened. They will come. Jacob leaned forward. Who? Before she could answer, hoofbeats thundered outside. Aiko's face drained of color. They found me. Jacob stepped outside. 4 men rode toward the ranch through the dusty road. At the front rode Sheriff Cole Mercer. Behind him were 3 armed deputies. Mercer was known across 3 counties, hard, cold, and never wrong, at least according to himself. Jacob stood calmly on the porch. The riders stopped. Mercer dismounted slowly. We're looking for someone, the sheriff said. Jacob crossed his arms. Most folks knock before they start searching my land. Mercer smirked. A Japanese girl. Jacob said nothing. She's accused of killing a man in town. The words hung in the air. Inside the house, Aiko heard every word. Her hands trembled. Mercer stepped closer. Mind if we take a look inside? Jacob's eyes hardened. No warrant. Mercer chuckled. Don't make this difficult, Hale. One of the deputies suddenly pointed. Sheriff. A shadow moved inside the house window. Mercer's smile widened. Well now. He walked toward the door, and reached for the handle, but Jacob stepped in front of him. Mercer frowned. Move. Jacob's voice was calm, but firm. Don't touch my wife. The deputies froze. Mercer blinked. Your wife? Jacob didn't flinch. That's right. Mercer studied him carefully. Everyone in the county knew Jacob Hale was a widower, yet there he stood, protecting a woman no one had ever seen before. Mercer narrowed his eyes. Something didn't add up, and he intended to find out. Inside the house, Aiko stood frozen. Wife? Why would he say that? Mercer stepped closer to Jacob. You expect me to believe that? Jacob shrugged slightly. We got married in Cheyenne last month. The sheriff stared at him. You married a Japanese woman? Jacob didn't blink. Is that a crime now? The deputies shifted awkwardly. Mercer clenched his jaw. No, but harboring a fugitive is. Jacob leaned against the porch railing. My wife hasn't harmed anyone. Mercer stepped forward. The man she killed was Thomas Barrett. Jacob's expression changed. Barrett, the wealthiest landowner in the territory, and one of the most feared men in Wyoming. Mercer continued. She stabbed him in his own office. Silence fell. Inside the house, Aiko closed her eyes, but Jacob noticed something strange. She wasn't afraid of being caught. She was afraid of something else, something worse, and deep down, Jacob suspected Barrett wasn't the victim in this story. Mercer finally stepped back. For now. I'll leave. But tomorrow morning we're coming back with a warrant. He climbed onto his horse. And if that girl's still here, she's coming with us. The riders disappeared into the night. Jacob returned inside. Aiko stood in the middle of the room. I am sorry, she whispered. You should not help me. Jacob poured 2 cups of coffee, then sat across from her. Tell me what really happened. She hesitated, then the truth spilled out. Thomas Barrett had been trafficking immigrant workers, men and women brought from overseas and forced to work on his land. Aiko had worked as a translator for the railroad company. She discovered what Barrett was doing, and confronted him, but Barrett had another plan that he tried to force her into silence. Forever. Aiko's voice trembled. He tried to kill me. So I fought back. And the knife. Her hands shook. Jacob leaned back slowly. This wasn't murder, this was survival, but convincing the law would be another story, because Barrett had powerful friends, and Sheriff Mercer was one of them. They didn't have to wait long. Just past midnight, a rifle shot shattered the window, glass exploded across the floor. Down. Jacob shouted. Another shot blasted through the wall. Aiko ducked behind the table. Jacob grabbed his rifle. 3 riders charged the ranch, not deputies, hired guns. Barrett's men. Jacob fired once. 1 rider fell from his horse, the others circled the house. Come out, Hale, one shouted. Hand over the girl. Jacob reloaded calmly. Not happening. More shots ripped through the walls. Aiko looked terrified. You must let them take me. Jacob shook his head. No. He glanced out the window, then smiled slightly because they just made a mistake. Aiko blinked. What mistake? Jacob stepped outside and fired his rifle into the sky. A signal shot across the valley. Lights began appearing, lanterns, dozens of them, ranchers, neighbors, old friends. Jacob Hale wasn't as alone as people thought. By sunrise, the ranch yard was full. Ranchers from miles around stood armed beside Jacob. They had heard the gunshots, and they trusted Hale more than any sheriff. When Mercer returned with his deputies, he found 50 rifles waiting. Mercer glared. What is this? One old rancher spat in the dust. Justice. Another stepped forward. Barrett's been abusing workers for years. Mercer realized something dangerous. The town was turning against him, and then something unexpected happened. A young railroad worker stepped forward. I saw Barrett attack the girl. Another voice spoke, and I saw his men bury 2 bodies near the river. The truth was finally spilling out. Mercer's authority was crumbling, but he still had one last move. He pulled his revolver. You're all interfering with the law. The crowd tensed. Jacob stepped forward. Then arrest me. Silence fell. Mercer stared into the sea of rifles, and slowly, he lowered his gun, because for the first time in years, he realized he was outnumbered. Spring arrived slowly on the Wyoming plains. The harsh winter winds faded, replaced by warm breezes that rolled across the wide-open grasslands. Patches of green pushed through the once frozen earth, and the cottonwood trees along the creek began to show their first leaves. Life on the ranch was waking up again. Jacob Hale stood near the western pasture, hammering a loose board back into a long wooden fence. The steady rhythm of his work echoed across the quiet fields. For the first time in years, the silence around the ranch didn't feel so heavy. A few horses grazed lazily nearby. Chickens wandered across the yard, pecking at the ground, and the house no longer felt empty. It had been several weeks since the truth about Thomas Barrett had finally surfaced. Once the rancher spoke up, everything began to unravel quickly. Investigators from Cheyenne arrived after rumors of Barrett's crime spread across the territory. They searched his land and discovered what many people had feared but never dared to prove: hidden graves, documents detailing illegal labor operations, records of money paid to silence witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Barrett's powerful reputation collapsed overnight. Some of his men fled the territory before they could be arrested. Others were captured and taken to trial. As for Sheriff Mercer, his position became impossible to defend. Though he had never been directly caught committing the crimes, his protection of Barrett had become painfully obvious. One morning, Mercer simply packed his belongings and rode out of town. No one tried to stop him. No one asked where he was going, and no one seemed particularly interested in seeing him again. With Barrett gone and Mercer out of power, the case against Aiko changed completely. Witnesses came forward. The railroad worker who had seen Barrett attack her testified in court. 2 ranch hands admitted they had helped bury bodies under Barrett's orders. Other workers described the abuse they had endured on Barrett's land. By the end of the trial, the judge declared what Jacob had already known from the beginning. Aiko had acted in self-defense, her name was cleared, completely, now the past was finally behind her. Jacob hammered the last nail into the fence and wiped sweat from his brow. The sun hung warm and bright above the open prairie. Behind him, he heard footsteps in the grass that he didn't turn immediately. He already knew who it was. Aiko approached slowly, carrying a small basket filled with fresh bread and vegetables from the kitchen garden. Her dark hair moved gently in the wind as she walked. She had changed a lot since the night she collapsed at his door. The fear that once filled her eyes had softened. Her posture was stronger now, more confident. For the first time since Jacob had known her, she looked truly at peace. She stopped beside the fence and leaned against one of the wooden posts. "You missed lunch again," she said with a faint smile. Jacob glanced at the basket. "Did I?" "You always do when you're fixing things." He chuckled quietly. "Habit, I guess." Aiko opened the basket and handed him a piece of bread. They stood there together for a moment, watching the horses grazing across the pasture. The ranch felt alive again. Finally, Aiko spoke. "You saved my life." Jacob shrugged slightly, taking a bite of bread. "You knocked on the right door." She looked down at the ground thoughtfully. "Many people would have turned me away." "Maybe," Jacob said, "but I'm not many people." She studied him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "You never asked me to leave." Jacob leaned his arms on the fence. "You planning to?" Aiko smiled faintly. "No." A quiet breeze moved across the plains, carrying the distant sound of cattle lowing somewhere beyond the hills. For several seconds neither of them spoke, then Aiko raised an eyebrow slightly. "You know, there is something I have been wondering." Jacob glanced at her. "What's that?" She crossed her arms playfully. "You told the sheriff I was your wife." Jacob looked out across the fields. "Well, seemed like the quickest way to keep him from dragging you away." Aiko tilted her head. "But you never corrected the lie." Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. "No reason to." "Why not?" He thought for a moment before answering, then he looked at her. A small, honest smile appeared on his face. "Because it wasn't the worst lie I've ever told." Aiko laughed softly, the sound carried across the open land like a fresh beginning. For years, the ranch had been a place of loneliness and silence, but now something new was growing there. Not just crops, not just cattle, something far more important. A second chance. The wind rolled gently across the prairie as the two of them stood side by side, watching the horizon stretch endlessly into the distance, and for the first time in a long while, Jacob Hale realized something surprising. The lonely ranch wasn't lonely anymore.